Welcome back to the class, and for today's class, the title of the lecture is Globalization Major Players, and this is written by George M. Thomas, and this essay as well is taken from George Ritzer's book Globalization, a Reader, and this book is one of our textbooks, and as it contains quite a lot of important and influential essays on globalization. So as I mentioned in the previous class, I will be following the specific arguments of the scholars so that it gives some kind of a clarity, and it gives some kind of a specific direction about the arguments and the position of a particular scholar. So this also will be a kind of a continuation of the past 2-3 classes that we have been talking about globalization. And all these classes are basically trying to understand or trying to gather a broader introductory picture about the subject of globalization, how complicated that it is, how diverse the theoretical position that is, how diverse are the substantial themes within this ambit of globalization. So in this paper, George Thomas tries to look at the major players, and interestingly he contrasts two major approaches towards addressing this very question: who are the major players? So can we enlist a number of players, as in the case a nation state, multinational corporations, and then international non-government organizations? Can we simply list them and then say that okay, these are the players? So that is one particular type of approach that George Thomas describes in the initial part of this essay, but then he argues that this is not sufficient, or rather this is a highly problematic way of understanding who are the major players of globalization, because in between these players, so there are a lot of other dynamics that really shape the individuality, shape the freedom, shape the agency, and then the freedom of each of these players. So you can't really list out the players and then say that these are the actual drivers of globalization, because situation is much more complicated. And this is also must be seen as a continuation of the previous class that we had when we talked about the major forms of globalization. How do we conceive of the form of globalization? Okay, so we discussed about the concept of glocalization. We discussed about the 3 or 4 major components identified by Roland Roberts and Kathleen White, including nation state, individuals, humanities, and then institutional structure. So let's see how George Thomas wants to explain these major players. So he argues that the conventional tendency, especially emerging from the realist theoretical position within IR, within international relations. You know that realism is a very important theoretical position within international relations. So, sorry about it. So the realist theoretical position, which is a more conventional way of looking at these players, is to identify several important players such as nation states, MNCs, INGOs, international non-governmental organizations, and so on, who act with presumably clear, coherent interest. So this is an extremely important point. Okay, so in the conventional wisdom, or in the conventional realist theory, we name or we list these actors, and then we think that these actors are able to act as per their own decision, their own discretion, their own set of they possess a coherent set of interest, and they act accordingly. Okay, because this is a very easiest way to understand that. For example, we think that always the interest of the nation state is to protect its boundary and to establish its sovereignty and to ensure the development of its people. So we think that the interest of the multinational companies could be different. Okay, but the point here is that assumption is very problematic. However, it is important to look at the world as a whole is influencing actors, and how actors are interacting in a world context that is, or at least recently has become out of control of any set of actors. So the most interesting argument is that the whole world is moving in a kind of a direction which we are yet to understand completely. Okay, we think that things are running out of control of any particular set of actors. Okay, so no particular set of actor is able to set agenda for the globe to for the world to evolve in a particular manner. No set of agents or no set of actors are able to define the path of global progress or global social change. Things are going out of hand. Nobody is able to set the kind of an agenda and then act accordingly. So this is an extremely important argument, because we will come back to this argument when we discuss Anthony Giddens' work, The Runaway World. The name of one of his books is this whole term, The Runaway World. Okay, so The Runaway World is a very captivating title, which actually tells you that the world in its most recent form looks like it is out of control. Okay, it's not acting as per anybody's intention. The kind of institutions and mechanisms that we created to control the world, control the whole world, seems to be quite inadequate, and looks like that they have developed a host of consequences and then side effects which we never intended, which we never understood, which we never even predicted, and the world is moving according to that, and we are at loss even to comprehend the kind of changes that are happening. So here the argument is that while these actors are important, but things are not following, or things are not moving the way these actors wanted them to move. Rather, there are the kind of interaction between these actors and much larger global processes are really redefining the nature of these important actors. So again, to come back to the realist position of a kind of an actor-centric approach that George Thomas wants to criticize. So for example, he begins with the transnational corporations or multinational corporations. From the 16th and 17th centuries, from 16th and 17th centuries on, these multinational corporations or transnational corporations helped create global capitalism and continue to reproduce capitalism as they pursue their interest worldwide. And this, that those who are familiar with familiar with colonialism, history of colonialism, that the history of colonialism is closely interlinked with the capitalist interest or the business interest of some of the important companies. The Dutch East India Company, then the British East India Company, and a host of similar huge business corporations from these colonial countries. They set out for expeditions, and they established business relations with different colonies, and then later it resulted in the kind of a complete colonization by the British Crown itself, or by different colonial powers themselves. So there is a very strong argument, especially from neo-Marxists. I mentioned in the previous class, including Immanuel Wallerstein and then Gunther Frank, who argue that these multinational companies for the past 4 or 5 centuries, they have been playing a very important role in deciding the world order. Okay, because the flow of capital is something so important. And I also mentioned, I hope you remember, that the very reason why certain geographies in the world were able to develop at much faster pace at the cost of others, okay, is being explained beautifully by these arguments by Gunther Frank when he talks about the dependency theory, when Immanuel Wallerstein when he talks about this world system theory. So that completely comes as a major criticism against the European forces who claimed that because of their industrial revolution, because of their scientific revolution, that they were able to become world powers. But it has a much darker past, which is very closely connected with that of colonialism. So these multinational companies, they have changed their character, especially after the World War, and the kind of overt or the kind of more visible form of exploitation or physical form of exploitation is no longer viable, but rather the logic of capitalist production, the logic of capitalist flow is the same. So they continue to reproduce capitalism as they pursue their interest worldwide. Now, Thomas argues that they are both competitive as well as collusive. They are competitive with each other to get the maximum market share, but they also collude with each other when they have to confront the nation state, or when they have to confront the local societies, or they have to face the opposition from the local societies. And this we know that very, very clearly, because at one stage they will be fighting with each other because they are arch competitors. They are competing with each other for the same market share. But when they have to fight the state or the local opposition or local manufacturers for that matter, they collude with each other. While multinational in nature, corporations were vehicles for concentrating capital in their home state and furthering national development at the expenses of development in other countries. This is exactly what we mentioned. So even though they are multinational in nature, so they played a very important role in concentrating capital in their host countries. Okay, so that is why we often hear about the neo-imperialism of America, or the American multinational companies, food chains, or huge soft drink companies, or a host of other companies which are mostly from the US, are able to spread its network, spread its business network across the globe. So what is happening through this global network of business interest is the flow of capital into their host country, and having very negative economic consequences on the countries in which they actually do the business. But let me also point out that these models themselves are becoming more complicated. It's becoming more complicated with different kind of logics coming in, different kind of business model coming in. Then the second important actor, the strong actor as per the realist school, is the nation state. And in international relations or in political theory, we used to identify nation state as having very specific set of features. So these are the important features of nation state. One is that it has this legal rational authority. So why that, or what is that something quite unique to nation state in comparison with the previous forms of administration or previous forms of governance, is that it is based on a rational legal authority. And those who have studied sociology will remember Max Weber here, because for Max Weber, the capitalism emerged in the Europe during a very specific period in time, mainly because it was also the time when this legal rational authority came into existence and established through the rule of law or through the nation state. Because nation state is important. Okay, a nation state as a very powerful agency that will ensure the rational legal authority is an important prerequisite for the growth of capitalism. And effective administrative control or monopoly of legitimate violence over a territory. A second important aspect of nation state is that effective administrative control. Okay, which again we have to go back to Max Weber when he talks about bureaucracy as a very efficient form of rational legal authority, which is of course characteristic of the modern nation state. And the monopoly of legitimate violence over a territory. This is yet another important feature of modern state. So modern state has the ability to inflict violence over its population in a given territory. That is why it has the police force as well as the military or paramilitary forces under its disposal. Okay, no any other forms of violence by anybody else, by extra state actors, becomes illegitimate, it becomes illegal, and that will attract punishment. But state alone has this power to attack, to kill, to eliminate people, because it claims to be having a rational legal power. This particular point has raised quite a lot of debates about human rights, the overreach of the state, a host of issues. But in a conventional sense, the state's authority over its territory is absolute. It is the sovereign power over a given geographical territory, and it has the monopoly over violence over its own citizens. And the incorporation of a population through citizenship. Yeah, we know that because the very basis of modern nationhood is that of citizenship, and anybody and everybody, irrespective of their caste or class or religion, are supposed to be equal members, and the pursuit of a national interest. So what constitutes national interest? How is it articulated? Again, it's a complicated story. I'm not going into that. But every nation survives on this particular rhetoric of a national interest. And sometimes this national interest can be defined as the well-being of all its people. Some other time, national interest can be defined as maybe something a kind of a position against some other country. So these things are very different. Then conventionally, the study of the world has been the study of international relations, that is, the relations among nation states. States act in national interest vis-a-vis other states, firms and domestic actors. So this very term international relations, this conventional modern social science, international relations or IR, it assumes that we are talking about a scenario where different nation states are actually acting with each other, and you need to understand that. Okay, so this particular idea is again conventional, which is being seriously called into question with other terms like transnationalism. So transnationalism is talking about a kind of a process which moves beyond all these nation states. So it's not something as if something exists between nation. It's a much larger process that supersedes or that transcends these nation states, and then every nation state is forced to do that. Okay, so there is a kind of a disciplinary difference, or a kind of a difference of orientation when we use this term international relations and then transnational relations. But the whole point that George Thomas wants to come back is that this globalization has really complicated this realist position. That the realist position, as we mentioned, that there are actors, including multinational companies and the states, and these actors are acting as per their interest. Okay, they have the agency, they have set agenda, set agency, and they are acting as per agency. So this assumption, George Thomas says that is heavily problematic. It's highly problematic. So the very nature of globalization that requires firms and states to adapt and be flexible to new technologies and trends. Okay, the intensification of globalization reveals that these strong actors are reactive and adaptive to globalization processes. Okay, so as we mentioned earlier, that instead of looking at these actors as if they are acting of their own will, that they are kind of exerting their own will, they have a set of agenda and they are acting in order to fulfill this agenda. Now we are forced to understand how different actors, including multinational companies and nation states and international non-governmental organizations, they are forced to react, okay, to a host of global processes on which they have very less control. Okay, and this is maybe the American scenario is the classic case. The current situation in the US, okay, the kind of a crisis that the US is facing is an excellent case in point, because America was the country that always stood for liberalization, a free market, capitalism, consumption, everything that you can attribute to that of globalization. But now if you look at America is facing the most serious backlash against globalization. And the present president, Donald Trump, he is initiating a host of anti-globalization processes, initiatives in order to protect the American economy. So it's very important to see that how even the countries who were seen as flag bearers of globalization, okay, are now turning around and then trying to defend their own national economy against the global processes. So many times these nation states are actually working, they are simply reacting to the processes of globalization. So global capitalism and the interstate systems are global contexts that shape actors' identities and interests. A complementary line of argument is to see global context as world institutional and cultural structures. So this term global context is something very important that George Thomas highlights. So what is this global context? Global context would be a complex combination of a host of geopolitical, economic, cultural and social scenario, okay, which is simply beyond the reach of any given country or any given strong player in that sense. A kind of a particular global context that exists today. For example, in the US or in the Europe, there are a lot of anxiety about immigrants. There is a lot of anxiety about job loss. There is a lot of anxiety about refugees. There is a lot of anxiety about jobs being lost or jobs being taken over by people who are coming from outside. So these contexts are something which no nation state can really ignore, or they can ignore at their loss. So a complementary global capitalism and the interstate systems are global contexts that shape actors' identities and interests. So a host of interstate systems and the kind of a trend of global capitalism is something that derives this global context, and a complementary line of argument is to see global context as world institutional and cultural structures. According to neo-Marxist critic of the autonomous actor such as world system theory, firms and capitalists individually and as a class are embedded in processes of capital accumulation. So this is what we mentioned when we talk about Immanuel Wallerstein. The latter are determining, okay, so this capital accumulation, how does capital get accumulated for these neo-Marxists is something so central. So that is why they can be described as a Marxist scholars, because for Marxian scholars the central question is about how capitalism work, or how capital mobilization takes place, okay, from where does capital is extracted, okay, and how this capitalism takes different shape, what are its consequences. So they would argue that the capital accumulation is determining all other aspects. That's a typical Marxian argument. It is influencing the nature of nation state, it is influencing the kind of ideologies, ideas, other actors and everything. The interest, strategies and actions of states and firms as well as ultimate outcomes are interpreted in terms of global exchange relations and flow of capital. So this is a typical neo-Marxian position. So if Marx had elaborated it on the basis of maybe early capitalist system, Wallerstein and others and other Marxians are able to extend that framework to understand the flow of capital, the other aspects of capitalist production in a global scenario. The emergence of institutional systems and interdependency among nation states to address a host of issues emerging out of a globally integrated economy and forms of production. So we are increasingly talking about the emergence of institutional systems. Okay, new forms of institutional systems are emerging, and there is increasing interdependency among nation states to address a host of issues emerging out of globally integrated economy and forms of production. So we realize that the world is facing global challenges. Okay? No nation state is able to address issues by their own. A host of global challenges require global responses. And the best example, the most recent example is that of the COVID pandemic. We know that how this argument is made again and again. So the argument is that in a globally interconnected world, there must be increased interdependence among various nation states to address a host of global problems, a host of global challenges, because these global challenges or global problems cannot be addressed or fought or engaged with by a single state. For example, I was giving the example of COVID-19. COVID-19 requires a global effort in terms of vaccines or in terms of other forms of protection. Similarly, in environmental degradation or global warming, these are, or for example, pollution, these are issues that assume a kind of a global character. So greater attention is given to institutions not reducible to interest of strong actors and within which states and firms are embedded. So I was mentioning that this is a major revision, or this is a major critique against the conventional realist approach which assume that these important players are able to act on their own will. Rather, here the argument is that these institutions and this global context work so powerfully that these important players are supposed to react quite often or to rearrange their own arguments and ideas. Then, so what are the major important systems or these agencies? So one of the important things that he identifies is international governmental organizations or larger bodies which are constituted by the governments themselves, or in other words we call it as IGOs, international governmental organizations, and quite a lot of important ones. We are mentioning only IMF and World Bank and GATT. These the role of nation states to enforce the decision of these organizations and the power struggles and negotiations. So we know that there are quite a lot of such kind of official state bodies that are established with the consent or with the active participations of nations across the globe, but still there are quite a lot of politics associated with that. Whether do these organizations work independently? Are they there to protect the interests of the weaker states? All these are a completely different set of debates, which we are not going into that. And similarly, the UN, the United Nations, through its universalism and ideology of voluntary participation of all nations, the UN provides fundamental legitimacy and identity to states. As globalization intensifies, more and more global problems are identified, and in each case, something needs to be done by someone. So, but this is also a very interesting scenario where we are seeing the role of UN is actually diminishing, isn't it? When we talk about UN as a more respected, powerful organization during 80s and 90s, but now when you look at it, America is threatening to cut short of its funding to UN, or India is criticizing UN for not making India a member of a permanent seat. So there are quite a lot of criticisms against UN, and there are opinions of arguments that UN is becoming inefficient, or it is losing its significance and it's losing its relevance. And there are a host of other international courts and tribunals: International Court of Justice, or World Court, or European Court of Human Rights, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, etc. IGOs and international courts and tribunals are all creatures of the interstate systems. So these courts and tribunals came into existence because the states realized that they require a much larger, much higher kind of an organization which is there to settle the disputes between different states or states and multinational organizations and other things. For example, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which has its headquarters in Hague, they very recently gave a verdict against Indian state in favor of the Vodafone, the big mobile company, saying that the money that they were supposed to have paid to India, some 20,000 crore rupees, need not be paid. So these are important institutions which try to negotiate, or which try to settle down, or which try to arbitrate in the cases between states or states and international organizations or capital or multinational companies. Then you have a host of other international non-governmental organizations and global civil society organizations, or INGOs. That is another very important set of players, okay, very powerful, extremely influential set of bodies which are not part of any official state but are extremely powerful, and a host of organizations working in the field of human rights. You have Human Rights Watch. Then environmentalism, you have this Greenpeace, World Wildlife, WWF, then consumer rights, and so on. INGOs claim to represent and express universal human interest, are individualistic and democratic in their goals and organizations, and are committed to global rationalism or progress. This is actually the kind of a position that they adopt. Most of these NGOs, they talk or they speak the language of liberal, secular liberalism with emphasis on human rights, on liberal values, and they try to present themselves as the champions of democracy, and they keep a watch on different countries and to see how, to what extent human rights is protected, to what extent environment is protected, to what extent wildlife is protected. So they were considered to be extremely important. But if you look at the current scenario, what we see is that the kind of a conventional legitimacy that they had is now being questioned. It seems that more and more nation states are increasingly seems to be dismissing their allegations or arguments, or are not taking them into taking them seriously. For example, organizations like Amnesty International, they're considered to be very powerful, but more and more states are now brushing aside their criticisms, and so is the case with, say, Greenpeace or other other organizations. And then another set of interesting set of players are these transnational religious organizations, and that's again a very fascinating topic. Because we know that organizations like Roman Catholic Church are global in its very character from the past, several centuries themselves. But what we are, or for that matter, how different religions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, spread to other parts of the world. They were all global. It doesn't mean that they are all becoming global now, but what is more interesting is that they are increasingly making use of the avenues of globalization, and then using all these possibilities of technology transfer, travel of people, and so they are also very important active players in that, especially new forms of spiritual movements, new religious movements. So there are a lot of interesting literature on that, new religious movements. What is the kind of a newness associated with that? New types of spirituality. For example, the Sri Ravi Shankar, the spiritual leader in India, or Amritanandamayi, who is a very important spiritual leader from Kerala. So both these figures, they have huge organizational structure that spread across the globe. They have offices and ashrams in quite a lot of foreign countries. So this is again a very important. They are very important players. And then similarly, there are these terrorist organizations. Ever since the whole world was very rudely awakened to the specter of terrorism after this 9/11, the Twin Tower attacks in the US. So you realize that a host of terrorist organizations, including Al Qaeda or ISIS, for example, they are operating at a global level. So it's not confined to one particular small country or other thing. They have a global network, and it's much easier for them to reach out to people across the globe through, say, social media, through WhatsApp or Facebook or YouTube. The propagation of their ideology becomes very important. Communication becomes very important. So building networks becoming important. So all these organizations are really making use of these opportunities provided by globalization. Then Thomas George also mentions influential individuals, because that's a very interesting argument, especially the elite. Okay, we can't reduce individuals to as a non-entity. Individuals play a very important role. The kind of the scientists, the intellectuals, the CEOs, the people whom we consider as the cream or as the elite. So they embody, they represent, they are the important people who really represent the processes as well as values, the materiality of globalization process. And without these actual individuals, because after explaining all these things, we also understand that it is human beings who are actually manifesting these forms of globalization, isn't it? Human beings undergo this process of globalization. They are the ones who are seen as the manifestations or as representatives of globalization. So this the people who are in the middle of all these things, the financial analysts, the software developers, the people who are working in advertisement agencies. So these people who are constantly traveling, people who migrate from one country to other, who are always on the move. So these are the people who really represent the when it comes to individuals, the people who are embodying the process of globalization. So these are the points that Thomas George is elaborating in his paper, the globalization, the major players. And as I mentioned, that he cautions us not to go by a very conventional understanding that these are the important factors, important players, and they are the people who are actually deciding the process of globalization. Okay, so that argument no longer holds, because we increasingly realize that there are a host of global forces, a host of global contexts that force these actors to act in a reactive manner. Okay? No nation state is able to set agenda to globalization as we know today. Okay? No multinational companies is able to set agenda for a nation state or for other people simply to follow. Things are not in anybody's custody. Nobody is a master of this process of globalization. So they all realize that they have to constantly adapt and then react to the unfolding processes that are coming as a part of globalization, and they need to adapt accordingly. So this is the most important argument put forward by George Thomas, which I found it's very important. So let us wind up this class, and also this one first week of classes, where I hope you must have got some idea about the introductory aspects or introductory explanations about the course, as well as about this whole idea of globalization. Okay, so I hope I have succeeded in communicating with you that the subject matter that we are going to study is extremely complicated, extremely vast, okay, multidisciplinary. It's not that something that you can study only from a sociological or political science or economics perspective. It's a multi-dimensional, multidisciplinary perspective, multidisciplinary, phenomenon, a subject that requires that. So in that sense, it's a complicated, it's a challenging thing to look into that. Okay. So next week we will start with one of the very important dimensions of globalization, that is cultural globalization. Okay. So see you then. Thank you.